Stop overreacting, it's just a small fall. I heard my husband snap, shaking me. His sister huffed, blaming me for ruining her party. But when the paramedic arrived and saw I couldn't move my legs, her face changed. She immediately called for police backup. The MRI would reveal something none of us expected. I didn't even want to go. But Thomas had insisted. It's just one night, he'd said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. We can go show face and then leave early. You know how Amy is about family. And that's how we ended up at Amy's house again, feeling more like a display piece than a guest. Amy's house was the sort that only exists in magazines, polished, shiny, and seemingly flawless. The floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the front of the house, letting in enough light to blind you. The marble floors gleamed so brightly that I was almost afraid to touch them. Everywhere I looked, I saw perfection. The perfectly curated furniture, the glimmering crystal chandeliers, the soft hum of high-end music playing in the background. It wasn't just a home, it was a carefully crafted image, a show. And there I was in my simple navy dress, the only one who didn't belong. I tried to hold myself together, keep my chin up, but nothing about the situation was comforting. I could feel the judgment in the air, thick enough to cut through. I wasn't even sure if it was real or just something I'd convinced myself of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a walking disaster amidst all this carefully curated perfection. Thomas, always the one to shrink into the shadows of his family, was doing exactly that. His face was drawn, his movements stiff. I knew how he felt. When we were with Amy and Brent, it always felt like we were on display, as if we were the imperfect sideshow in a world that demanded nothing less than flawless. I tried to hide behind his broad shoulders, hoping his presence might shield me from the scrutinizing gazes of the crowd, but even Thomas seemed to disappear into the background the moment we stepped inside. I glanced around the room, noting the laughter and chatter that filled the air. Everyone was smiling, everyone was talking, but I couldn't help but feel like an outsider, a misplaced puzzle piece. Thomas never stood up to Amy or Brent. He didn't argue with them or call them out. He kept his head down, smiled when he had to, and let the night unfold without a word. I understood why he didn't want to rock the boat. But that didn't mean I was okay with it. The longer we stood there, the more the walls seemed to close in. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was just a side note in a story that wasn't mine. I wasn't important here. I wasn't even seen really. In their eyes, I was just Thomas's wife, an afterthought, a filler in their picture-perfect world. It wasn't long before Brent, Amy's husband, noticed us. I caught his eye from across the room and his lips curled into that familiar smirk. It wasn't a smile, it never was. It was something sharper, something colder. He looked at me like I didn't belong, like I was an inconvenience in his perfect night. "Looks like you finally decided to show up," he called over, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, though no one seemed to mind. I felt my cheeks flush, the heat spreading across my face in embarrassment. Thomas looked at the floor, his fingers gripping his drink a little too tightly. He was already retreating even before Brent had spoken. The pressure in the room was building, and Thomas, who always preferred to stay out of the spotlight, was just giving in. I saw the way his posture slumped. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was resignation. He was already preparing himself to disappear in this world, and it made me feel small. I tried to shrug it off, to focus on something, anything, other than the sinking feeling in my stomach. The food table caught my attention, and I found myself absent-mindedly picking at a cracker, pretending to be busy. But I couldn't ignore Brent's mocking tone. It was his way of making me feel even more out of place. The guests in the room laughed, half out of politeness, half out of amusement. But the laughter felt hollow, as if they were all too accustomed to this game. It wasn't just Brent who was playing. Amy too was complicit. I noticed her standing by the doorway with her friends, glancing over at me and then turning away with a dismissive smile. It wasn't so much what she said but how she said it. "You're looking pretty relaxed, Nancy," she commented, loud enough for me to hear. "We're all working hard to have a good time. You should try it sometime." Her words stung. I could feel her eyes on me as if I was some sort of specimen to be judged. I wanted to say something to defend myself, but I didn't know how. What was I supposed to say? Was I supposed to tell her that I didn't feel welcome? That every second of this night was a reminder of how out of place I felt? I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. I could feel the invisible walls between us growing higher. It wasn't just that I didn't fit in with their world. It was that they didn't even see me as worthy of being included. To them, I was just a shadow, something Thomas had dragged along, an accessory to his existence. I glanced at him again, hoping to catch his eye, to silently ask for support. But he wasn't looking at me. He was already absorbed in the background noise, retreating further into himself. The divide between us was growing, widening with every passing moment. In that moment, I realized something. I was no longer just an outsider to Amy's world. I was invisible in Thomas's too. Brent's voice cut through my thoughts, dragging me back to the present. "Hey Nancy, are you sure you're having a good time? You don't look like it." He sauntered over to me, a glass of champagne in his hand, his grin wide and mocking. I wanted to say something to call him out for making me feel like dirt, but I didn't. Instead, I just nodded, my throat tight with the words I couldn't say. I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to let him get to me no matter how much I wanted to. Brent's eyes sparkled with amusement, and I could see him calculating his next move. It wasn't just the usual teasing anymore. It was something more deliberate, something cruel. I realized then that it wasn't about me being out of place. It was about him making sure I stayed there, reminding me that I didn't belong. As I stood there, feeling smaller with every passing second, I knew that this night would change everything. The growing sense of inadequacy, the way Thomas had retreated even further into the shadows. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't just going to stand here and let them tear me down. But I couldn't figure out how to fight back. Not yet. As the party went on, I tried to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach, the coldness in my chest. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the thought that I was about to find out just how far they were willing to push me. How far they would go to keep me in my place. And that, more than anything, terrified me. I had watched Brent's games before, seen the way he'd bully Thomas, but never did it hit me how deep the cruelty really went. How much Thomas had taken, how much he had suffered. That night, standing in the middle of Amy's lavish living room, I felt the weight of it crash down on me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. When Brent grabbed Thomas by the arm, pulling him from the edge of the conversation and into the center of the crowd, I could feel the tension snap tight. It was like the whole room held its breath. Laughter died down, leaving only the buzz of idle chatter and the clink of glasses. For a moment I couldn't move. I just stood there, watching in disbelief as Brent's hand gripped Thomas's arm. I should have spoken up immediately. I should have shouted at Brent, told him to let Thomas go. But all I could do was watch. Thomas, as always, didn't resist. His shoulders hunched slightly as if he was bracing for impact. The fight had long since left him. I had seen it before. The way he retreated inside himself when his brother-in-law took control of the room, the way he allowed himself to be humiliated over and over again. His silence was his surrender, but it wasn't something that was visible to anyone but me. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. What was I even going to say? Could I convince everyone that this wasn't some harmless joke? Could I get them to see that this wasn't just another one of Brent's twisted pranks at Thomas's expense? As I looked around the room, I could see the smirks and the knowing glances. No one seemed surprised. No one even blinked. I tried to focus on Thomas's face, on those dark eyes that I knew so well, but they were hollow. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. It was a face I'd seen countless times before, one that told me everything I needed to know. The anger, the frustration, the silent plea for it all to stop. He was so tired of this, but he never said a word. Instead, he stood there, quietly enduring, because that's what he'd been conditioned to do for years. Amy's laugh rang out, shrill and high-pitched, as she casually turned away from us. "Oh, lighten up, Nancy," she called, as if I was the one overreacting. "It's just Brent. Don't be so dramatic." She didn't even look back to see what was happening, too absorbed in her own conversation to notice the damage Brent was inflicting. The weight of her words, though meant to dismiss me, hit me like a punch in the gut. How could she not see? How could she not feel the cruelty in the air? I turned my attention back to Thomas, trying to catch his eye, but he was already slipping away, his gaze distant, like he was somewhere else entirely. Maybe that's how he coped with it, by disappearing inside his own mind. But it didn't work on me. I knew the cost of that silence. Brent's voice cut through the room again, louder this time. "Come on, Thomas," he jeered, his hand still tight around Thomas's arm. "You've always been a party pooper. I swear you could lighten up just once for me, for all of us, huh?" I watched Thomas's face, and in that moment I saw the exhaustion. The burden of years of this. Of being the butt of Brent's cruel jokes. Of always being the quiet, unassuming one, the one who never pushed back, never fought back. I wanted to say something, anything to stop it. But the moment Brent's hand tightened on Thomas's arm, pulling him closer to the middle of the room, something inside me froze. The crowd was watching us now. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment heavy in the air. My heart pounded in my chest, a steady, suffocating beat. But I said nothing. Amy's voice carried from across the room, casual and unaffected. "Don't mind them, Nancy. Just let them have their fun. You'll get used to it." Her tone was so matter-of-fact, as though she'd seen this same performance 1,000 times and it no longer meant anything. I could feel my blood boiling. How could she be so blind? Or was it that she simply didn't care? I had never really understood how deep the divide ran between us. How could she, who had everything, not see how much her husband tormented mine? How could she not notice that her brother was breaking him down, piece by piece, night after night, in front of her own eyes? The laughter from the crowd faded into background noise as I stood there, unsure of what to do. I had spent too many years tiptoeing around, keeping quiet, thinking maybe things would change if I just kept my mouth shut. But I could see now that it was never going to change. Not until I did something. Brent shoved Thomas roughly toward the pool, and I felt the air rush out of me. Time slowed as I saw Thomas's feet slide, his body unbalanced, and then splash. The sickening sound of his body hitting the pool steps echoed through the room. I froze. For one horrible, excruciating second, everything was still. Then the reality hit me like a cold wave. Thomas didn't move. He didn't stand up. He didn't shout, didn't laugh it off. He just lay there, half in the water, half on the cold, hard steps. His face was pale, his body completely still. The laughter in the room continued, but it sounded distant, like a far-off memory. The only sound I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, my own heartbeat hammering in my chest. I moved, but it felt like my legs were made of lead. My body moved on its own, but my mind stayed frozen. "Thomas!" I called, my voice breaking. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder, trying to get him to respond. But he didn't. He just lay there, lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A laugh. I looked up, my heart sinking even further as I saw Brent watching, leaning against the wall, still smirking like it was all part of the game. "Come on, Thomas, it was just a joke," Brent said, his voice dripping with mock concern. But I saw it in his eyes, the thrill. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed having power over Thomas, humiliating him in front of everyone, making him feel small. I turned my attention back to Thomas, but the panic was building now. "Thomas, please, please wake up," I whispered, my fingers trembling as I checked for signs of life. But there was nothing. He was unresponsive. The room, for a brief moment, fell silent. Everyone watched, but no one moved. Brent's eyes flickered to the crowd, and for the first time that evening, I saw a hint of nervousness cross his face. The fun was over. Something was wrong. And I could feel it too. The paramedic arrived soon after, but by then my mind was in overdrive. I had no more patience for Brent's games, no more tolerance for his cruelty. The man I had loved for years was hurt, and the man responsible for that hurt was standing right there, pretending it was just another laugh. When the paramedic looked down at Thomas, then immediately pulled out her phone, calling for backup, I knew this wasn't just a prank anymore. This was serious. The rest of the party faded away. The laughter, the food, the conversation, it was all gone. All that mattered was Thomas, lying there, motionless in a way that felt like an omen, something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. The shrill laugh that had once been a familiar sound of discomfort from Brent seemed distant now, drowned out by the deafening silence that filled the space around me. The moment Thomas hit the pool steps, everything else in the world seemed to fall away. The laughter of the guests, the music that had been playing, the chatter that had filled the air moments ago, it all faded into nothing. All I could hear was the sickening crack of his body against the hard concrete, and then the rush of my own heartbeat thumping in my ears. Time didn't seem real anymore. It stretched, then folded, then became a blur. I remember pushing through the crowd with desperation clawing at my throat, my legs shaking under me as I stumbled forward. The floor felt slick beneath my feet and I could feel my breath coming in ragged gasps, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was getting to Thomas. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands trembling as I reached out. "Thomas." I cried, but my voice sounded so small, so weak against the monstrous weight of the moment. His body lay awkwardly, half in the pool, half propped against the concrete steps, his face pale, his features twisted in an expression of pain that made my stomach turn. He wasn't moving. Not at all. His eyes were open, but they didn't focus on anything. They stared, unseeing, at the blue sky above him. My heart skipped a beat as I gently touched his arm, shaking it, hoping, praying for a sign that he was still with me. I wanted him to move, to blink, to say something, anything that would make this nightmare feel like it wasn't happening. But nothing. I reached for his legs, hoping to help him sit up, but as soon as my hand touched them, I knew. His legs were limp, completely unresponsive. My breath hitched in my chest. The world felt like it had dropped out from under me. He wasn't moving them. Not a twitch. Not a single shift of his muscles. I felt an icy dread pool in my stomach. This wasn't a simple fall. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. "Thomas, please," I whispered desperately, my voice breaking. "Please wake up." There was no response. No sign of movement. My hand hovered over his legs, my fingertips trembling as they brushed against the cold skin. The weight of the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. His body wasn't responding. The sound of his fall had been too loud, too forceful for it to be nothing. I looked around, hoping for help, for someone to notice that this was no longer a joke, no longer some roughhousing between Brent and Thomas. But no one was looking. No one seemed to notice that Thomas, my husband, was lying lifeless at the edge of the pool, half in the water, his body crumpled like a rag doll. Brent stood off to the side, still chuckling like nothing had changed. His arms were folded, a smug look on his face, eyes glinting with some dark satisfaction. "Come on, it's just a little fall," he said, his voice light, casual. "He'll be fine." I could hardly believe my ears. Did he really think this was just a little fall? Did he not see the horror unfolding before him? Did he not see the way Thomas's body lay so still, so completely unresponsive? Did he not feel the dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach, the cold terror that had wrapped around my chest like a vice? Amy, too, didn't react the way I expected. She didn't rush over to her brother. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, watching from a distance. "You're ruining my party, Nancy," she muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes as if I was the problem here. Ruining her party? Her party? My mind reeled, disbelief clouding my thoughts. Was she seriously more concerned about the party than her own brother lying motionless on the ground? "Help him!" I yelled, my voice rising in panic, but no one seemed to hear me. The party, it seemed, was more important. The laughter and music resumed as if nothing was wrong, as if this was just another moment to brush under the rug. I couldn't just sit there, couldn't let this go unnoticed. Not anymore. With trembling hands, I reached into my bag and fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with a shaking finger. "Please," I whispered into the phone, my words rushing out in a frantic stream. "My husband, he's not moving. He fell and he's not responding. Please, you have to help him. Please." The operator's voice was calm, professional, but it didn't help the terror bubbling inside me. They promised help was on the way, but I didn't know how long it would take, how much time we had. I looked down at Thomas again, still half in the pool, his body slack, his breathing shallow. Was he breathing? I couldn't even tell anymore. My hands hovered above his face, not knowing whether to touch him, whether it would make things worse. I didn't know what to do. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet the rest of the world seemed to be moving on as if this was just another moment. But this was no joke. This was real. This was happening. The paramedic arrived just a few minutes later, her face a mask of professionalism, but I could see the moment she assessed the situation. Her eyes flicked from Thomas to me, then back to Thomas, and she immediately pulled out her radio. "We need backup." "It's not good," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Everything around me seemed to blur, the edges of the world fading as my mind focused solely on Thomas. The paramedic's words were like a slap to the face, a stark reminder that this wasn't just some accident, some minor fall that would heal with a few days of rest. This was serious. This was life or death. As the backup arrived, a flurry of movement surrounded us. But still, no one seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, the emotional toll it was taking on me. I was losing him, losing the one person I had always counted on. I stood back, helpless, watching as the medical team worked, hoping against hope that it wasn't too late. But the minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The life I had known, the one where everything felt manageable, where everything was predictable, was slipping away from me. I could no longer deny the truth. My husband wasn't just hurt. He was broken. The ambulance arrived soon after, and I was left standing there watching them lift Thomas onto a stretcher. His body remained limp, unresponsive. And as the doors closed behind him, I was left standing at the edge of the pool, watching his figure disappear into the night. Everything had changed. Everything was different now. And I had no idea what was coming next, only that I was terrified of it. The first time I heard the term spinal fractures, I didn't fully understand what it meant. In my head, fractures were something that happened when you fell off a bike or stumbled down a staircase. You get up, brush yourself off, maybe limp around for a bit, and then eventually you heal. I never imagined that something so simple as a fall could leave behind wounds that went deeper than bone and flesh. But the MRI results told a different story. They weren't just a series of broken bones scattered across the image in front of me. They were the silent history of a person too afraid to speak up, too broken to complain, too used to hiding the pain. And those fractures, some old, some recent, were a map of his suffering, his silent torment. I felt like I was looking at a road map of Thomas's agony, drawn in sharp lines that connected years of injury to the present moment. I could feel the coldness of the room around me, the sterile smell of antiseptic clinging to the walls. The doctor's voice was clinical, professional. But the words she spoke sliced through me one after the other. The fractures in his spine aren't just from today's fall. There are older fractures here. Some of these injuries are months, maybe even years old. Repeated trauma. This isn't an accident. This is ongoing injury. I could hear the blood pounding in my ears, drowning out the doctor's explanations. All I could focus on were those images. The fractures, the bruising, the way the bones seemed to sag under the weight of what they had endured. How had I not seen it? How had I let this go on for so long? For years, Thomas had complained about pain in his back, in his neck. He'd tell me he was tired, that his muscles were sore. I had chalked it up to the stress of work or just getting older. I told myself that everyone had aches and pains, that we all got worn down in different ways. When he'd winced or rubbed his neck, I thought it was just the result of him pushing himself too hard. But I never considered that something far more sinister was at play. Never once did I stop to wonder if there was a deeper cause to the suffering he hid behind that quiet smile. The MRI was a wake-up call. It wasn't just the fall that had injured him. This was the result of years of torment, years of Brent's cruel jokes. I could see the patterns now, in those jagged lines on the images, in the way they had been placed one after the other, like milestones in a long, painful journey. How had I been so blind? How could I have missed the signs when they were right in front of me all along? I remembered the times Brent had pushed Thomas around at family gatherings, the rough way he'd grab him, shove him, spin him. I'd always brushed it off, told myself that it was just their way of bonding, just how they played. After all, I was used to the way Amy had shrugged off his behavior, laughing along with him, encouraging it, making excuses for him. She'd always said, "Oh, it's just Brent being Brent." She'd never seen what I was too afraid to see. I had ignored it. I had convinced myself that Thomas was exaggerating, that his complaints were just him being oversensitive. How many times had I told him to stop being dramatic? How many times had I brushed aside his discomfort, assuming it was nothing more than him being tired or worn out? How many times had I chosen to believe that nothing was wrong, simply because it made me feel more comfortable? I wanted to protect the image of the perfect family, and for that I had allowed the truth to slip away from me. I turned a blind eye, not wanting to see the cracks that had been forming in our lives for years. But now the truth was undeniable. The pieces had fallen into place. Every time Thomas had brushed off his pain, every time he had smiled through his discomfort, it had been a sign of just how deeply Brent had hurt him. This wasn't some isolated incident. This was a pattern of abuse, and I had been complicit in it. I had allowed it to happen. I had stayed silent, told myself that I couldn't get involved, that it wasn't my place to speak up. As the doctor continued to explain the extent of Thomas's injuries, I could feel the weight of guilt pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had failed him. I had failed to protect the one person I loved most in this world. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let this happen? The tears I had held back for so long now threatened to spill over, but I couldn't let them. Not here. Not now. I had to focus. I had to be strong for Thomas. But the shame, the guilt, it was crushing. And then in that sterile room Thomas spoke. His voice was weak, almost imperceptible, but it sliced through the fog of my thoughts like a blade. "He did this," he whispered, his words coming out in a strained breath. "Brent. He's been doing it for years." My heart stopped. His words hit me harder than any physical blow could. It wasn't just about the fall. It wasn't just some random accident or some unfortunate mistake. Brent had been hurting him for years and I hadn't known. I hadn't seen it. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about physical injury. It wasn't just about bruises or fractures. This was a betrayal of trust. This was a violation of everything I had thought I knew about our family, about Thomas, about our relationship. Brent had taken advantage of Thomas's kindness, his willingness to keep the peace, his need to please. And I had let it happen. I had watched as Brent tore him down piece by piece and I had done nothing. "Thomas, I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. But the words felt so hollow, so inadequate. They couldn't undo the years of pain he had suffered. They couldn't fix the damage that had been done. Thomas turned his head slightly, just enough to look at me. His eyes were tired, the weight of his words pressing down on him, but there was something else there too. Something softer. A flicker of understanding. He wasn't angry with me. He was broken, but not by me. He was angry with Brent. And in that moment I realized something that had been hidden from me for so long. This wasn't just about me failing to see the truth. This was about the silence we had both allowed to envelop us. The silence that had allowed Brent's cruelty to continue unchecked. I wanted to say more, to tell him how sorry I was, how I wished I had known, how I wished I had been strong enough to stop it all. But the truth was, there were no words for this. The damage was done and now we had to face the consequences. But something inside me stirred, something fierce and protective. I couldn't undo the past, but I could fight for the future. I couldn't let Brent continue to get away with what he had done. I couldn't let this go unpunished. This wasn't just about physical injuries. This was about the toll Brent had taken on Thomas's soul, his trust, his dignity. I squeezed Thomas's hand and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I was finally standing with him. Not behind him, not beside him, but with him. Together we would face this. Together we would take the first steps toward healing. The truth had been revealed, and it was more painful than anything I could have imagined. But now I knew what I had to do. And I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I stood in the police station, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like an anchor I couldn't escape. The room felt sterile and cold, its starkness only highlighting the magnitude of what I was about to do. I had spent years running from this truth, hoping someone else would speak up, hoping Thomas would stand tall for once, hoping that things would change. But they hadn't. They were never going to. The police officer across from me watched me carefully, his expression unreadable, but I could see the faint flicker of compassion in his eyes. I was shaking, trying to steady my breath, but the adrenaline coursing through me was almost too much to handle. I had kept quiet for so long. I had turned a blind eye to the abuse. I had watched my husband be torn apart piece by piece and I had done nothing. But now it was different. Now I had no choice. "I need to tell you everything," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. About Brent. About what's been happening to Thomas all these years. The officer nodded, leaning in slightly. "Take your time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to listen." It felt like everything inside me had built up over the years and was now pouring out all at once. I told him about the incidents I had witnessed. The bullying, the taunting, the roughness that had always been brushed off as harmless fun. How I had told myself it wasn't that bad, that Brent was just being himself, that Thomas was just too sensitive, too eager to please. How I had stayed silent, telling myself it wasn't my place to intervene, that it wasn't my problem. But now it was. It was my problem. It had always been my problem. I had allowed this to happen to Thomas for years. I had let Brent continue his games, and I had turned a blind eye when it should have been my responsibility to protect Thomas. The guilt hit me harder than I had ever imagined. How could I have been so blind? How could I have been complicit in this? I felt my chest tighten as I recounted everything. How Brent had pushed Thomas around at family events, how he'd made cruel remarks, how every moment felt like a test of endurance for my husband. How Thomas had always just shrugged it off, how he had never spoken up, how he had let it go on because he didn't want to rock the boat, didn't want to cause trouble. But now, as I sat in that cold room facing the truth of what had been happening, I couldn't hide from it anymore. It was time to face the music. It was time to take action. As I spoke, I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me. I was angry at Brent for what he had done. I was angry at Amy for enabling him, for turning a blind eye to the damage he had caused. But most of all, I was angry at myself, for not seeing it sooner, for not doing something sooner. I should have spoken up. I should have protected Thomas. I should have stopped pretending everything was fine. After I finished telling the officer everything, I sat back in my chair, exhausted. The weight of what I had just done was suffocating, but it was also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a voice. For the first time in years, I wasn't hiding. I wasn't protecting the family image. I wasn't keeping the peace. I was speaking the truth, and it felt like a small, fragile victory. The officer took a few moments to process everything I had said. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but firm. "Thank you for being so open," he said. "This will help. We'll need to gather all the evidence, the footage from the party and any other records you have. But it's a step in the right direction." I nodded, my hands shaking in my lap. The hardest part was done. But the real challenge lay ahead. I had taken the first step, but now I had to face the consequences. Brent, Amy, and the rest of the family. I had to confront them, not just for what they had done to Thomas, but for what they had done to me, for what I had allowed to happen. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout to begin. Amy called me the next day. Her voice, when it came through the phone, was shrill and defensive. "What did you tell them, Nancy?" she demanded. "What's going on? Why would you go to the police about something so trivial? It's just a little fall. Thomas always makes things bigger than they are." Her dismissive tone made my blood boil. "It's not just a fall, Amy," I said, my voice steady despite the anger that was rising inside me. "It's years of abuse. Years of your husband hurting Thomas. Years of me ignoring the signs and allowing it to happen. I'm not going to keep quiet anymore." She scoffed. "This is ridiculous. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. You don't understand." "No, Amy, you don't understand," I cut her off, my voice firm. "You've been turning a blind eye to your husband's behavior for years. You've let him bully Thomas, humiliate him, and you've done nothing. You've enabled it, and I've let it happen. I won't do that anymore. Not after what happened last night. Not after everything I've seen." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought she might finally understand, might finally realize the weight of what had been happening. But then her voice came back, defensive and cold. "This is your problem now, Nancy. You've made it a problem. And you're ruining everything." The words stung, but I didn't let them control me. I had made the decision. I had taken action, and I wasn't going to back down now. Not for her. Not for Brent. Not for anyone. The video footage from the party arrived a few days later, and when I watched it, my stomach twisted. There was no denying it. The way Brent had shoved Thomas toward the pool steps. The way Thomas had fallen. The way everyone had laughed. The truth was undeniable. There it was, in black and white. Brent had thrown him, and the world had watched. The evidence was clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some harmless prank. Thomas had been victimized. And now, with everything on the table, I couldn't look away. I couldn't ignore it. But the real shock came when I realized something even deeper. This wasn't just about what Brent had done. This was about my role in enabling it. About how my silence had allowed the abuse to continue. How had I let this go on for so long? How had I let myself protect the family image, let myself protect the perfect facade at the cost of my husband's well-being? I had been complicit. And now, I was facing the consequences of that complicity. It wasn't enough to just speak the truth. I had to live with it. I had to face the consequences, not just for Brent but for myself too. But it was time to take a stand, for Thomas, for me, for everything we had been through. It was time to break free from the silence. And it was time to fight for the truth. The first few moments I stepped into the courtroom, I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. Fear, anticipation, a sense of dread, but also, somewhere deep inside, a spark of relief. This was it. This was the moment I had feared and hoped for all at once. It had taken so long for us to get here, so much silence and pain, so many years of not speaking up, not standing up for Thomas, but now the truth was out. The journey to this point had been long, but standing there with the evidence in front of me, I couldn't help but feel that it was all coming together. The only thing left now was for justice to be done. I glanced at Thomas sitting beside me. His hands were trembling and I could see the nerves in his eyes. But there was something else too, a quiet strength, a resolve I had never seen before. It was like he had shed the burden of years of silence. For so long he had been the one to take the blows, the one to absorb the hurt, never saying anything, never asking for help. But today in this room he wasn't hiding anymore. Today he was taking control. Brent's lawyer was trying to twist the truth, spinning the story into something unrecognizable. It was just a harmless prank, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. Thomas has always exaggerated these things. He's always been the one to make a mountain out of a molehill. I wanted to stand up, to shout at him, to say that this wasn't a prank, that this wasn't just some harmless joke. But I didn't. I stayed seated, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. The truth had already been laid out. The video footage, the MRI results, and Thomas's testimony, they all told the same story. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Brent had hurt Thomas for years, and I wasn't going to let his lawyer twist that reality. The video footage was hard to watch. It was brutal, watching the way Brent had shoved Thomas toward the pool steps, the way Thomas had fallen. It wasn't the fall that hurt. It was everything that led up to it. The taunts, the laughter, the cruelty that had been hidden behind a mask of jokes for so long. When I saw that footage again, I could feel the bile rise in my throat. This wasn't just about a single fall. This was about years of torment, years of humiliation. Thomas's testimony was the moment of truth. His voice, shaky at first, grew stronger as he spoke, and I felt a surge of pride swell in my chest. It wasn't the same Thomas the first had seen for years. The one who had kept quiet, the one who had let Brent's words and actions slide by. This was a different Thomas. This was a man who was finally finding his voice. "I've taken this for years," he said, his voice steadying with each word. "But this time I can't let it go. It's not just the fall. It's everything that's happened before it. The way he's treated me. The way I've let it go. I should have said something long ago, but I didn't. But I won't be silent anymore." I had never heard him speak like that. The raw emotion in his words made the hairs on my arms stand up. He wasn't playing the victim. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He was taking his power back. And in that moment I saw him, truly saw him, for the first time in years. As the words left his mouth, I could feel the courtroom shift. There was no denying it. The truth was undeniable. Brent had pushed Thomas too far for too long, and the evidence was inescapable. I saw Brent's face, his smirk fading, his confidence crumbling. He had always thought he was untouchable, that he could get away with whatever he wanted, but now the world was seeing him for what he truly was. A bully, a coward, a man who hid behind his power and used it to hurt others. When the verdict came, there was a collective breath held in the room. The judge's words felt heavy as they echoed through the silence. Brent was guilty. The words I had been waiting for, hoping to hear, were finally spoken. But even though the verdict was a victory, it didn't bring back the years of suffering. It didn't undo the harm that had been done to Thomas. No amount of justice could ever do that. Brent was sentenced, and as the gavel struck down, I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. The battle had been won, but the scars, the pain, the damage, it couldn't be erased. I looked at Thomas, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a flicker of peace in his eyes. We had done it. We had taken the first step toward healing, toward rebuilding what had been broken. But the real shock came when I saw Amy's face. She wasn't charged, of course, but her reaction spoke volumes. Her eyes were cold, defensive, as if she couldn't understand why any of this had to happen. She was still in denial, still unable to see the truth of what had been happening for years. But as I looked at her, I realized something. Amy was as much a part of this as Brent. She had enabled him, stood by him, and turned a blind eye to the harm he caused. She had chosen to protect her perfect image, her perfect family, rather than face the truth. The trial was over, but the damage it had caused would linger. The aftermath was just beginning, and it wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time I felt like I could breathe. I felt like I was no longer drowning in the silence, in the lies. We were no longer hiding. We had spoken the truth, and that was all we could do. After the trial, Thomas and I returned home, but it didn't feel the same. Our house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a battleground. There were things we had to face, things we had to rebuild. But we were no longer the same people we had been before. We were stronger together. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be ours to walk. And for the first time in years I felt hopeful. The lessons we learned through this whole ordeal were hard to swallow but necessary. Silence doesn't protect anyone. Silence only feeds the monsters that grow in the dark. We learned that speaking the truth, no matter how painful or difficult, is the only way forward. We had let the lies fester for too long, and now it was time to live in the light. We had taken the first step, and no matter how long the road ahead might be, we would walk it together. As we left the courthouse that day, I looked at Thomas, his hand in mine. The past didn't define us anymore. It had shaped us, yes, but it no longer controlled us. Our future was ours to shape, and together we would rebuild it piece by piece. The scars would remain, but they wouldn't define us. We were stronger now, and we had each other. And that was enough. Thank you for following Thomas and Nancy's journey toward healing and justice. Every moment of their story is a reminder that speaking the truth is the first step toward freedom. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? If you were moved by their story, please like, subscribe, and share to keep their voice alive.